In 1954, the United States government removed a democratically elected president from power because an American fruit company complained about its land. That company was the United Fruit Company. That president was Jacobo Árbenz of Guatemala. His crime was a land reform program that paid the company fair market value for unused farmland and redistributed it to poor farmers. The CIA ran the operation under the codename PBSUCCESS. It used a combination of psychological warfare, radio propaganda, and a small mercenary force to destabilize the Guatemalan government. Agency operatives spread disinformation about a Soviet invasion that was never coming. They bombed civilian targets. They bribed military officers to abandon Árbenz. It worked. Árbenz resigned in June 1954 and fled the country. The CIA installed a military junta in his place. Guatemala then entered decades of civil war, state-sponsored massacres, and authoritarian rule that killed an estimated 200,000 people. The land went back to the United Fruit Company. This actually happened documents history's worst chapters, the well-known and the forgotten, to understand what they reveal about power, human nature, and civilization. Because history demands to be remembered. Jacobo Árbenz was 37 years old when he stood before the Guatemalan Congress on March 15, 1951, and took the oath of office. He was the son of a Swiss-German pharmacist, educated at the military academy, married to a woman who read Marx, and genuinely, stubbornly convinced that a country where 2% of landowners controlled 70% of the land was a country that had not yet decided to exist. He was also, though he did not fully know it yet, already a target. Guatemala in 1950 was not a communist state. It was a poor agricultural country emerging, haltingly, from a century and a half of dictatorship. The revolution of 1944 had ended the 14-year rule of Jorge Ubico, a strongman who had governed with the United Fruit Company's grateful blessing and kept indigenous Guatemalans in a state of near-feudal servitude through vagrancy laws that forced unpaid labor. What followed Ubico was something genuinely unusual for the region. 2 consecutive free elections, a functioning Congress, an independent judiciary, and a president who believed the state had a responsibility to its poorest citizens. What Árbenz wanted, at its core, was not radical by the standards of the post-war democratic world. He wanted land reform. Specifically, he wanted to break up the vast, underutilized estates, called latifundios, and distribute parcels to the landless peasants who worked them. The program he proposed, Decree 900, passed in June 1952. It would ultimately redistribute 1.5 million acres of land to roughly 100,000 Guatemalan families. Here's what makes this stranger still. The land targeted for redistribution was not, in most cases, actively farmed. The law required compensation, bonds valued at the land's declared tax value, and it applied only to uncultivated holdings above a certain size. It was modeled, in several respects, on land reform programs the United States itself had recently supported in Japan and Taiwan. Árbenz was not nationalizing industries. He was not imprisoning political opponents. By the standards of 1952, he was governing like a moderate social democrat. But one of the largest landowners in Guatemala was not a Guatemalan. The United Fruit Company, a Boston-based corporation with operations across Central America, owned roughly 550,000 acres in Guatemala, and under Decree 900, approximately 400,000 of those uncultivated acres were subject to redistribution. The Guatemalan government offered compensation of just over $1 million, based on the value the company itself had declared for tax purposes. United Fruit demanded 25 times that amount. The difference between those two numbers is where the coup begins. United Fruit was not merely a company. It was, in the language of the time, a state within states. It owned the country's main Atlantic port, Puerto Barrios. It owned the only railroad connecting the capital to the coast. It operated its own telegraph network, its own commissary system, its own judicial apparatus on its plantations. It paid minimal taxes, employed tens of thousands of workers at wages it set unilaterally, and had spent decades cultivating relationships with every government in the region, relationships maintained through a combination of bribery, economic leverage, and the implicit threat of American displeasure. When United Fruit felt threatened, Washington felt threatened. That was not a coincidence. It was a business model. The company's lobbyists and public relations machinery moved quickly after Decree 900. Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud and widely considered the founder of modern public relations, was hired directly by United Fruit to manage the American press narrative. Bernays arranged press junkets to Guatemala, fed journalists pre-written stories, and coordinated a sustained campaign to convince the American public that Arbenz was a communist foothold in the Western Hemisphere. The New York Times, Time magazine, and the New York Herald Tribune all ran pieces reflecting United Fruit's framing almost verbatim. This was not independent journalism stumbling onto a story. This was a corporation purchasing a narrative. And the narrative landed in Washington at exactly the right moment. The Korean War had just ended. McCarthy was at his peak. The Rosenbergs had been executed. The CIA, barely 6 years old, was looking for proof that its covert action capabilities were worth the investment. And in the State Department and the National Security Council, two men with unusually direct connections to United Fruit had risen to positions of extraordinary influence. John Foster Dulles, Eisenhower's Secretary of State, had previously been a senior partner at Sullivan & Amp. Cromwell, the law firm that had long represented United Fruit's interests in Guatemala. His brother, Alan Dulles, was the director of the CIA. Alan held stock in United Fruit and had worked alongside Sullivan and Cromwell in legal matters tied to the company's interests. Their personal financial entanglements with the company they were now tasked with protecting through American foreign policy, that is not an allegation. It is a documented fact, acknowledged in the historical record without serious dispute. The conflict of interest was structural and absolute, and nobody in the Eisenhower administration appeared to consider it disqualifying. Now, the operation they designed had a name: PBSUCCESS. It was formally authorized by President Eisenhower in August 1953, with an initial budget of $3 million, later expanded. The plan was not a conventional military intervention. It was something more precisely engineered, a psychological warfare campaign designed to make Arbenz believe he was facing a military force large enough to defeat him, to destabilize his government from within, and to trigger either a coup by his own officers or a resignation under pressure. The CIA recruited a Guatemalan exile named Jacobo Árbenz to lead the nominal invasion force, a ragged collection of perhaps 480 men trained in Honduras and Nicaragua, with the cooperation of those countries' dictators, both of whom had their own reasons to want Guatemalan democracy discredited. But the invasion force was almost beside the point. The real instrument of overthrow was a CIA-operated radio station broadcasting as La Voz de la Liberación, the voice of liberation, transmitting fabricated reports of military advances, invented troop numbers, and phantom defections designed to convince Guatemala's army that resistance was futile. What makes the PBSUCCESS playbook genuinely chilling is its clinical precision. The CIA's own internal planning documents, many of them declassified between 1997 and 2003, describe specific psychological pressure points: which officers to target for bribery, which newspapers to subsidize, which rumors to seed in which communities. One document outlines a plan to assassinate specific Guatemalan political figures if the psychological campaign failed. The list existed. The mechanism was prepared. The threshold at which murder would be authorized was written into the operational plan of the United States government. Arbenz knew something was coming. He had received intelligence from multiple sources suggesting American involvement in opposition activity. He had tried, in the months before the coup, to purchase weapons from Western suppliers to replace aging Guatemalan army stock, and found every door closed. The United States had quietly pressured Britain and other allies to deny him arms. When he finally secured a shipment of rifles and ammunition from Czechoslovakia in May 1954, it was immediately presented by the Eisenhower administration as proof of Soviet infiltration. The fact that Arbenz had turned to a communist country only because every democratic one had been instructed to turn him away. That detail was not included in the American press briefings. He was being maneuvered. Step by step, the corridor of possible responses was narrowing, and the people narrowing it controlled the narrative about why he had ended up in the corner. The invasion began on June 18, 1954. Jacobo Árbenz crossed the Honduran border with his 480 men and almost immediately stalled. His forces were badly equipped, poorly coordinated, and outnumbered by the Guatemalan army several times over. By any conventional military assessment, the operation should have collapsed within days. But that's the part most people never hear. The invasion wasn't supposed to win on the ground. It was never designed to. The real war was being fought in the frequency spectrum above Guatemala City, where La Voz de la Liberación broadcast invented victories into the homes and barracks of Guatemalan officers around the clock. CIA pilots flying unmarked aircraft bombed a military base at Zacapa and dropped leaflets over the capital. The psychological pressure was methodical, relentless, and exquisitely targeted. And it worked. Not because the Guatemalan army was defeated, but because its senior officers decided they didn't want to find out if they could win. This is the mechanism worth understanding. Arbenz had the military capacity to crush Castillo Armas's ragged force. His own commanders knew it, but they also knew, or believed they knew, that behind Castillo Armas stood the United States Air Force, and they were not wrong about that. CIA aircraft had already bombed a British cargo ship in Puerto Barrios by mistake. The signal was received. America was in this, and America did not lose. On June 27, 1954, 9 days after the invasion began, Jacobo Árbenz resigned. He went on national radio and delivered a speech that was, under the circumstances, remarkably clear-eyed. He said that the United Fruit Company and the American government had conspired to remove him because he had dared to challenge the privileges of a foreign corporation. He said that Guatemala's crime was attempting to carry out a modest, democratic economic reform. He said that he was stepping aside not because he had been defeated militarily, but because his own officer corps had abandoned him, and because he would not ask Guatemalan civilians to die in a war that American power had already decided to end. Then he walked out of the presidential palace, was taken to the Mexican embassy, and went into an exile that would last the rest of his life. This deserves a moment. A democratically elected president, governing under a constitutional framework, with majority popular support, implementing a land reform modeled on programs the United States itself had championed elsewhere in the world, was removed from office in 9 days by a psychological warfare operation run out of a CIA station in Miami on behalf of a fruit company whose lawyers had previously written the legal briefs of the men who authorized the coup. That is not a summary of events. That is the event. What followed Arbenz was Castillo Armas, who entered Guatemala City on July 3, 1954, greeted by a CIA officer named Tracy Barnes and a parade. Within weeks, he had reversed Decree 900 entirely, returning the redistributed lands to their previous owners, including the 400,000 acres back to United Fruit. He disenfranchised illiterate voters, roughly 70% of the population. He established a National Committee of Defense Against Communism, which compiled lists of suspected subversives. In the first months, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 people were arrested. Some were executed. Others simply disappeared. The committee eventually listed over 70,000 names. Castillo Armas was assassinated in 1957 by one of his own palace guards, which did nothing to interrupt the logic his government had set in motion. What came after him was a succession of military governments, each more brutal than the last, underwritten at various points by American training, American weapons, and American intelligence. The CIA's intervention had not just removed a president. It had dismantled the institutional architecture, the independent judiciary, the land reform apparatus, the political parties, that might have given Guatemalan democracy somewhere to rebuild from. Now, here is the fact that was held back from the first half of this episode, and it is the one that makes everything else land differently. The Guatemalan Civil War that followed the coup did not end in 1954. It ran, with varying intensity, for 36 years. From 1960 to 1996, successive military governments and their allied paramilitary forces killed an estimated 200,000 Guatemalans. A 1999 United Nations Truth Commission, the Commission for Historical Clarification, found that state forces and allied paramilitaries were responsible for 93% of the violations documented. It found that acts of genocide had been committed against Maya indigenous communities. And it concluded, with the precision of a formal legal body, that United States support for Guatemalan military forces had contributed to the commission of those crimes. That is the 36-year consequence of a 9-day coup. The through line from 1954 to the present is not metaphorical. It is demographic and direct. The same communities whose land redistribution was reversed in 1954, whose political participation was stripped, who survived or did not survive the violence that followed, are the communities whose descendants make up a substantial portion of the Central American migration flows that have dominated American political debate since the 2010s. The particular cruelty of this is historical. The country that destroyed the conditions for a dignified life in Guatemala now debates, loudly and bitterly, what to do about Guatemalans appearing at its southern border. The cause and the consequence exist in the same news cycle, rarely introduced to each other. But here's the thing. The Guatemala operation was not an isolated act. It was a template. The CIA's own internal after-action assessments of PB success were celebratory. The operation became a model for future interventions. Iran in 1953, Cuba in 1961, where the template failed catastrophically, Chile in 1973, and operations across Southeast Asia and Africa that drew on the same playbook. The lesson the agency took from Guatemala was that covert regime change was achievable, controllable, and deniable. That lesson was wrong on all three counts, but it took decades of blowback to begin to establish that. The Dulles brothers, John Foster and Alan, never faced any formal accountability for their conflicts of interest or for the consequences of the operation they championed. Alan Dulles ran the CIA until 1961, when Kennedy fired him after the Bay of Pigs. He subsequently served on the Warren Commission investigating Kennedy's assassination, a detail that history records without apparent irony. John Foster Dulles died in office in 1959. United Fruit eventually merged into Chiquita Brands International, which in 2004 pleaded guilty to making payments to a Colombian paramilitary organization designated as a terrorist group by the United States government, paying a $25 million fine. The corporate character, it turned out, was consistent. What Guatemala reveals, when you sit with it long enough, is not simply that powerful interests corrupt foreign policy. That observation is true, but insufficient. What Guatemala reveals is the specific mechanism by which a democratic framework is neutralized. First, the narrative is captured. Then, the options are foreclosed. Then, the institutional infrastructure is dismantled. And then, when the long violence follows, it is attributed to local pathologies rather than the engineered conditions that produced it. The people who built the machine are rarely present when it runs longest and hardest. Arbenz died in Mexico City in 1971, at the age of 57, reportedly from drowning in his bathtub. He had spent 17 years in exile, stateless for much of that time, watching the country he had tried to reform consume itself in a war whose origins he understood better than almost anyone alive. He never returned to Guatemala. His wife, Maria, survived him and lived until 2009, long enough to see the United Nations Commission confirm, in formal legal language, what her husband had said on the radio on the night he resigned. He had been right about all of it. That did not help anyone who was already dead, but it is the kind of truth that civilizations are supposed to keep track of, because the alternative is to let the people who built the machine write the history of the fire. If this episode made you think differently, subscribe. New episodes every week. And if you want to go deeper, there's more waiting for you.